Welcome everybody to this webinar, which is the 8th, staged by our project on populism and constitutional democracy, which is funded by the Australian Research Council. And these webinars, you should be warned, are recorded. You can watch the others through our website, globalconpop.blog, or on YouTube. And you'll be notified when this one is edited and appears online. We have to thank the Australian Research Council and also the COVID pandemic for encouraging us to do what really happens in Australia, host discussions with some of the leading thinkers in the world on democracy and its challenges and its challengers. And the webinars are part of a research project on what the three musketeers of the project and panelists today, Adam Czarnota, Wojciech Sadursky, and I call anti-constitutional populism. And in fact, we've just edited a book under that title, which will be published with Cambridge University Press in March. One of the greatest sources of inspiration of our project has been today's guest, Professor Jan-Werner Müller, who published what remains one of the most influential books on populism, What is Populism, in 2016. Jan is Roger William Strauss Professor of Social Sciences, Professor of Politics, and founding director of the Project in the History of Political Thought at Princeton University. He's published numerous work on political thought and political practice, many of them centrally concerned with the nature and conditions and challenges and challengers to democracy, and will today discuss his recent work, Democracy Rules, with the intriguing subtitle that varies the well-known triad, liberty, equality, uncertainty, and we'll doubtless return to those themes during the discussion. Jan joins us from Princeton. As usual, our panel is Adam Czarnota of the University of New South Wales and University of Wrocław in Poland, Wojciech Sadursky of Sydney and University of Warsaw, Centre for Europe, and me, University of New South Wales and Central European University Democracy Institute in Budapest. Hans' latest book is a brisk, lively, elegant, accessible, wide-ranging, and profound examination of the nature of contemporary challenges and challengers, I'm sorry I've used that expression another third time, to democracy, who today threaten us with what he calls fake democracy. It has 4 chapters, which I divide, and I think are divided, into the first 2, fake democracy and real democracy, which characterize the challenges to real democracy and what is being challenged. The next 2, on critical infrastructure and reopening, are diagnostic and prescriptive. What's needed to restore democracy to health, and, as Lenin might have said, but in a worse cause, what is to be done? And the coda ends with tentative prognosis and evaluation of the circumstances in which we live. So let's get into them, and perhaps, if I may box or ask you to take us through these 3 categories. First, analysis and characterization. Secondly, diagnosis and prescription. And thirdly, prognosis. So what's fake about fake democracy, and what's real about real democracy, fake democracy? Yeah.
So first of all, thank you to what I guess is generally referred to as the 3 musketeers. Thanks for having me in the webinar, and thanks for everybody else, especially those who, I find this quite remarkable, are willing to get up at 8 a.m. for this kind of thing. So thank you for having me, and thank you all for being part of it. So what is fake about fake democracy? Well, I think there are sort of different categories of this. In a certain way, you might say all these fake democracies are unhappy in their own ways. Nevertheless, I think a number of generalizations can be warranted for all the important national differences. So for one thing, I think they'll be characterized by what our colleague, and I think in many cases our friend Kim Shapley, has described as autocratic legalism. So there is, an incredibly careful attempt to bring about substantial change, but always in such a way that one can tell observers, especially outside observers, that the letter of the law, though of course very often not the spirit of the law, has been observed. So a lot of what we might consider a sort of standard template of constitutional democracy will at first sight not look all that different from what we know in real existing democracies, for all their obvious shortcomings. I'm not saying that real democracies as we know them in any way are perfect or truly live up to basic principles in all cases. But the kind of core change that happens in this shift to fake democracies is that a real turnover of power becomes basically extremely hard or unlikely. So in a sense, I'm not saying anything terribly new. I'm not saying anything that some of our colleagues in comparative politics haven't already tried to get at when they played around with various concepts that many of people in this conversation, of course, will know, be it competitive authoritarianism, hybrid regimes, all kinds of other attempts to find an appropriate concept for a gray area between more or less well-functioning democracies and situations where you have outright dictatorship or outright disavowal of basic democratic values. And of course, if I may add one thought, it is still remarkable that despite the much talked about democratic recession, we're still in a situation where virtually all countries want to be seen as democratic. Remember that in the run-up to Biden's Summit for Democracy, even Beijing put out this extraordinary document where they were trying to explain how actually China, as it is today, lives up to democratic expectations more successfully than the United States. That's not unprecedented if you actually do go back in 20th century history. It's of course also important not to have a totally cartoonish image of what has sometimes been described as an age of ideological extremes. Certainly plenty of people in the Soviet Union also would have officially said, we live up to democratic expectations. In fact, we're a better democracy. And less well known, there were even some parts of the Nazi regime where they said we actually practice something that we can describe as Germanic, as an authentic democracy, whereas the Western liberal democracies are effectively plutocracies and so on. So I'm not saying this phenomenon is completely new, that various regimes are trying to talk the talk of democracy, despite all the evidence of their actual characteristics to the contrary. But it remains still astonishing that globally, despite the overall recession, this remains the most prized label to stick on oneself.
You, in the chapter on fake democracy, you both talk about agents and political leadership in general, something that you emphasize the significance of, but also you talk about underlying pathologies. I wonder if you could say a word about where the dangers you think come from actively, that is, who's doing it, what sort of people are doing it, and what are the weaknesses that they are, if you like, exploiting.
So at the risk of sounding horrendously pedantic, even more pedantic than the average professor, let's say, I would insist that it remains very important to look very closely at specific national constellations. In the last 5 years or so, there has been a not illegitimate demand to sort of identify the one macro factor that explains it all, be it economic, be it cultural, be it a mixture of the two, and so on. But I'm sorry to say that there simply isn't a 140 character or even 280 character answer to the question what might be some of the underlying causes. I'm not saying it's all arbitrary. I think you can certainly identify a number of patterns. But what I would warn against, and this might be a less obvious point, is to conclude from the similarities in some of the patterns of governance that we see in, just to pick a couple of more or less random examples, Orban's Hungary, Erdogan's Turkey, Modi's India, or for that matter, Maduro's Venezuela, to basically conclude from these similarities in governance that the underlying causes must be similar or even somehow the same. That doesn't really follow. I find it much more plausible to argue that the similarities are a result of a certain degree of mutual learning and basically a sort of transnational transfer of certain practices, but also a certain rhetoric of governance, such that, among other things, we also should let go of the maybe genuine post-war illusion, not that history had ended. I don't believe that anybody ever really truly thought that, but rather that democracies are sort of uniquely well placed to learn from the past, to learn from each other, have a sort of inbuilt epistemic advantage. Whereas I think it was genuinely assumed post 1989 that authoritarians are all bound to end like the Soviet Union, that they can't learn from their own mistakes, they can't really understand what is happening in their own societies, and so on. And I think that was a mistake, which is not to say that these regimes are, invulnerable or nothing can be done. But the point is simply they can learn, and some of the similarities are not necessarily conclusive evidence of underlying similar factors that have led to their rise, but they're rather a reason to assume that they can learn from each other. So far, a complete dodge of your actual question. I think one of the things that can be meaningfully said and that I try to make plausible in the book, but that is not, I hasten to add, the one sort of development that could sort of give us the clue to what is sometimes by now, I would say, in a very cliched way described as the supposed global rise of populism. But nevertheless, what I see as a real structural challenge to democracy is what I call the double secession. By that, I mean that at least in a number of countries, basically, to put it bluntly, the wealthiest are taking themselves entirely out of a genuine social contract. And at the bottom of society, it's not that though the most disadvantaged consciously want to take themselves out of a social contract. It's more a matter that they simply seem to feel that the social contract simply isn't working for them anymore. And hence it doesn't really truly make sense to participate. This is empirically, at least for a number of cases, pretty well proven. Increasing rates of abstention, which kind of creates a vicious circle because parties don't care about people who don't vote for the most part. So whatever pathologies are there tend to get worse. So hence double secession, but without any, I hasten to add, any suggestion that these secessions are sort of on the same level or are in any way morally symmetrical or are driven necessarily by the same factors. But the point is that contrary to at least in my perspective, sometimes too facile invocation of a crisis of democracy, where we're made to believe that sort of any policy challenge is automatically a crisis, or any large-scale dissatisfaction with existing democracies is a crisis. These, I think, are genuine challenges, structural challenges, and it's important that we address them, and in particular that we find plausible institutional solutions to address them.
So that leads us really, what's at stake? What is the thing that's being challenged, which you advocate, and that's real, and seek to characterize, and that's real democracy? What is it that makes real democracy a different sort of creature from fake democracy?
Well, I think what I'm about to say will not be sort of groundbreaking news for everybody in this meeting this morning, but it's basically an attempt, and to some degree, actually, the reality of living up to the underlying commitments to liberty and equality. And maybe less obviously, of course, these values can sometimes pull in different directions. So when we think about, let's say, campaign finance, which, if I understand it correctly, is also currently a very contentious issue in Australia, then yes, certain amounts to equalize might sometimes have to push back against certain ideas of freedom and the other way around. Nevertheless, unless we remain committed to free political expression, the very thing that, of course, in what I call fake democracies is often highly restricted, if we don't live up to certain aspirations to political equality, which is, I'm not telling you anything new either here, is massively threatened by increasing levels of material inequality, we are moving further and further away from anything that we could call real democracy, which is another way of saying we're moving further and further away from situations where we can have genuine changes in power. And I'm sure some of you in the audience by now, are ready to jump in and say, but look, that's exactly the problem. We have plenty of democracies where real change precisely seems precluded by certain entrenched interests. We're still facing situations where you might say certain, to put it bluntly, capitalists de facto have a veto power over certain kind of changes. I'm not disputing these sorts of arguments as something that weakens, the argument for saying that, yeah, at least some of our democracies are closer to living up to these genuine values. But my point is, we ought to have this discussion in regard to these underlying values and with a view to basically changes in power. And I sort of insist on bringing the two together because, as you can tell by now, I'm somewhat sympathetic to basically accounts from our colleagues in comparative politics who would, get very close to a minimalist Schumpeterian understanding of democracy and talk about, changeover in power, peaceful changeover of power is important. But because that's not enough, and basically, elites handing over to the next elite and then back to the first elite and so on, that's why I'm also bringing in the richer normative picture and try to tie it back to freedom and equality.
Okay, so what do you need? Since we're in a world where a lot of fake democracy and real democracy is under strain, what would be needed, on your view, to restore or counter the trend?
So again, you won't be surprised to hear that I'll say something incredibly pedantic first, which is that, of course, there is no panacea. There isn't a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. If you take what I was trying to communicate earlier seriously, then yes, some of the variables in play should be clear enough. So a stop on the massive increase in socioeconomic inequality that we've seen over the last couple of decades, but maybe less obviously, and this is also at the core of the book, for better or for worse, a repair or renovation of the actual means to effect certain changes. So as we all know, policy challenges never present themselves in a vacuum or in the abstract, and nor are solutions ever a matter of finding the one correct technocratic fix. What we really need is what I in the book called a critical infrastructure of democracy, which still crucially depends on well-functioning political parties and in particular a well-functioning basically environment of well-functioning news media organizations. Again, I know that this is not, super exciting news, given what many people have been talking about in the last couple of years. But what I'm trying to do in the book is also offer a specific justification for how we should think about these institutions. I'm not dismissing other institutions which very often tend to turn up in these discussions. So highlighting these two in particular is not meant to dismiss, let's say, trade unions or other civil society organizations, etc. My point is simply that, contrary to some of our colleagues who are willing to be done with these more traditional institutions, who are even in some cases willing to be done with representative democracy as we know it altogether, are willing, for instance, as you know, to switch, for instance, to rule by citizen assemblies entirely. I want to make the case, at the risk of sounding overly conservative, that as long as we have representative democracies, and of course, one day we might not, but as long as we have them, these sorts of institutions remain absolutely crucial, and we should think more carefully about what we actually need from these institutions, and be less fixated on sort of individual leaders, and also be less fixated on sort of an immediate sort of policy challenges. They are important, but of course we can't address them if that larger critical infrastructure has decayed, has fallen into disrepair, simply doesn't work anymore, because then we simply don't have the tools to address these challenges.
In your last chapter on reopening, you discuss a number of initiatives, some of them quite radical initiatives, and I hope we'll come back to those. But I thought, in order to open up the discussion, perhaps just one last question to begin with. In your preface, you start with the question which many people are asking and to which you return through the book. whether democracy is today in crisis, and you're suspicious of the word, but you take it seriously. And I'm not asking for a yes or no answer, but could you say you return to it in your 5 reasons for hope in the coda of the book? And I wonder if you could just conclude our introductory part of our discussion to say something about the question which constantly arises, are we in crisis? Why so many people are asking it at the moment, and then about the answer, why we should care and what you think.
Okay, and I've got 3 hours left to engage with this.
Okay, and then we'll open for discussion.
Yes, good. So, as already hinted, I think crisis talk is A, completely overdone, and B, hopelessly imprecise. And maybe less obviously, I think it's been very unhelpful, to put it mildly, that too often the crisis discussion has either gone in the direction of basically blaming the people. I mean, for a certain type of liberal, I dare say, it's become acceptable again to talk about the people in a way that, would have been standard for late 19th century, sociologists, social theorists of mass democracy. They're all irrational. They're all waiting for the great demagogue to seduce them and so on. Things that wouldn't have been said in polite liberal society 10, 15 years ago are now completely okay. And of course, the other extreme of the discussion is then to say, no, it's not the people, of course, it is, nefarious, evil elites and so on. And as different as these two perspectives are, they do, of course, have one thing in common, which is in both cases, they are talking about particular groups of people, be it the many or the few. And not enough attention is being paid to basically institutions, and in particular, this critical infrastructure of democracy. And there is a crisis. But the fact that some people are dissatisfied or that Trump wins an election, I mean, these things are not conclusive evidence of a crisis. Neither is it a crisis if many people register discontent. So for me, at least, these sort of attempts to point to surveys and say, oh, look, what a horrendous result, or look at young people, they don't seem to, be as committed anymore to democracy as maybe previous generations were, are relatively meaningless. But the actual decay in institutions, which of course is not unconnected to what people think, but is just a different focus than simply sort of speculating about mentalities, be it about the many or the few, in its own way strikes me as somewhat apolitical. And I would have thought, especially among a group of lawyers, I mean, that's not a completely crazy perspective to say, let's look at this actual institutional dimension and let's sort of go easy a little bit on the kind of armchair sociology, which endlessly talks about anger and resentment and speculates about all kinds of sort of psychological things, which again, I either find patronizing or at the very least not terribly helpful in actually explaining a lot of what is happening out there. So the crisis talk is not completely wrong, but a lot of the actual crisis talk that we've been having at least for 5-6 years by now, I think is misleading at best.
Thank you. I said it was a rich book, and even from 20 minutes of exposition, I think you can get a sense of that and a taste of that. If we can go back to your characterizations, both descriptive but also normative. I know that Wojciech has a couple of questions to do with the underpinnings, the philosophical underpinnings of your conception, and perhaps Wojciech, you could start.
Yes, so thank you, Jan, for joining us. And I fully join Martin in all the praise for the book. I think it's a wonderful book. One of the most striking feature of it is how nicely it combines certain form of conservatism, which is the word you yourself used a moment ago to self-characterize, sort of small c conservatism, understood as an attempt to retrieve the deep traditional resources in democratic liberalism, with the great courage for innovation and in looking at all sorts of forms of revitalizing democracy, which are still seen by many traditional political scientists and lawyers with a great degree of skepticism. And the other thing which I found extremely valuable in your book is that when talking especially about representation, which is one of the main pillars of democracy, you sort of depart from a certain conventional wisdom of political science and very openly look at the what may be called supply side, in contrast to the demand side of democracy, and especially when it comes to democratic backsliding. And you emphasize what you call the dynamic and creative aspect of representation. I think this is something that many people who try to explain whatever happened in Poland or Hungary or India or the Philippines do not give sufficient justice to. That is this sort of creative aspect of politicians who, in your words, is the craft and creativity of politicians that will at least partly decide the answer about where to draw the lines among different groups which are their constituents. So in that sense, I think this is the book which provides some very important new intellectual resources for our thinking about so-called crisis of democracy. But to help you maybe introduce further topics of your books beyond those which you have mentioned, let me ask with a question, and then I'll come later in the debate with my perhaps more important, more philosophical question. But let me start with something which is perhaps almost very marginal, but which struck me. So right at the very beginning of your book, when you talk about this sort of populist revival and so on, you retrieve or you refer to currently very deservingly famous theory of Ernest Fraenkel of dual state. And this theory, which sort of has been, I think, by and large forgotten for many years, but now has been sort of resurrected, mainly by Jens Mayenheinrich in his great work, talks about this sort of dual state, Nazi state, which consists of a normative state and this arbitrary prerogative state. And you say at page 11, and that refers to the countries which sort of I'm mainly interested in, though they are not listed here. Let me quote, you say, now the realm of, what if today we were once more facing dual states, but with a difference? Now the realm of politics remains in many respects relatively normal, but for some legal-looking manipulations, while in the economy, one is subject to the arbitrary exercise of power. And I was struck because on the face of it, it seems to me it's exactly the other way around. So it's sort of paradoxical that that's the way you place the contrast. I mean, to me, countries like Poland and Hungary have more or less putting corruption to one side, which you probably cannot, but you have corruption more or less everywhere. It has in the microsphere, in economy, in commerce, in trade, it has a more or less good rule of law of market society. But in politics, it's total chaos and total arbitrariness and nonsense and anarchy and most of all, this sort of prerogative state in which the government is not constrained by anything, including the constitution. So why do you draw that contrast in such a paradoxical, to my mind, way?
Yeah, thank you for pushing me on this. So as you may remember, this is partly inspired by the work of the Hungarian sociologist and politician Bali Madja, who, as many of you will know, has sort of put out a number of important quasi-Weberian accounts of how we should think about what he ends up calling the mafia state, and where I think he does show quite convincingly that there are parts of the economy, not the entire economy. So an important distinction is between the economy that is internationally exposed. And as we all know, sort of, what are the three most important reasons why Orban might continue in power? Three most important reasons are BMW, Mercedes, and Audi. So, that's something, where it can look relatively normal. But there are other parts where I think we have plenty of evidence that you do get a certain kind of politicization, sometimes obvious, sometimes not so obvious, and where the sort of overall damage to democracy is not entirely explained by this, or it doesn't just revolve around that. So I'm not disputing you. I'm not saying that, oh, in politics everything is perfectly fine. I mean, as you pointed out yourself, it's not, although with important differences. So what happened to the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland, if I'm not sure you'd agree with putting it quite so crudely, but is a somewhat different matter than what has been happening in Hungary and a number of other countries. I mean, clearly the sort of overall conditions for autocratic legalism are not the same. So do you have a constitution changing majority? What can you get away with? What is your template of institutions you start out with, and so on? So I agree with you that one shouldn't conclude, and therefore in politics everything is fine. Still, for me, it does remain an important difference that all these regimes will go out of their way not to produce images or not to do anything that would remind especially, but not only outside audiences, all too clearly of basically 20th century style authoritarianism. So to put it bluntly, it's still not the kind of thing that some of these rulers will do openly, that you get the knock late at night on your door from the secret police. But you might get suggestions from your employer how you should vote. And maybe to prove that you are really sort of on the right side of things in certain ways. So that's what I was trying to get at, that we have these sometimes very informal mechanisms that can ensure a certain kind of loyalty that certainly does matter on voting day. But this is also, of course, an ideal type. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same in every country. We're going to see exactly a similar sort of dual state structure in every single case. Plus, as you were also very politely, and I'm grateful for that, hinting, of course, many other countries that we tend to count as more or less well-functioning democracies might exhibit somewhat similar pathologies. So, clientelism is not unknown in other parts of the world. There are sort of other ways to exert economic pressure, that are not that unfamiliar even to individuals living in more or less well-functioning democracies. But still, I think this is a kind of, again, a sort of perverse innovation of sorts. Again, it might be enabled by particular local circumstances, in some places more than others. But that's why, long story short, I thought the kind of dual state logic remained important, and also remained an important tool as we think about the question as to what has changed since the 20th century, how perversely these leaders themselves may have learned. We all want to learn from history, but I think we tend to assume that only politically good people learn from history, and that might not always be the case.
Thank you. One of the things that's distinctive and that you stressed in outlining some of the theses of the book is your suspicion of overly personalized stories and your emphasis on what you call critical infrastructure. And of course, lawyers have to be interested in that, or at least pretend to be. And Adam, I know, is interested in it, and I ask him to intervene. He's the guy who looks a bit like Mephistopheles against that black background in front of you.
Thanks, Martin. And thanks very much for the book. When I read your book, I accept it totally. I couldn't disagree with anything what you said. So therefore, my questions actually are not related precisely to the book, but what is missing, in my opinion, from the book, right? And let's start maybe with the question of knowledge as such. It means the role of knowledge in contemporary democracies. It means contemporary societies and contemporary democracies are very complex, right? It looks like. And I do agree with you when you use the Machiavelli's methodological suggestion of this, what you called riduzione verso in principio. But I also think that sometimes it could be quite impossible to do, especially in relation to the contemporary complex democracies. I also appreciate very much, it means the use example of the Athenian democracy, but it seems to me that it could be quite often very misleading, right, as such, right? So what I think about is that what is the role of the epistemic authorities in the contemporary democracies? Because it looks like that from my reading that this topic actually was sort of the slide off, right? It means that you mentioned in relation to the Athenian democracy the role of the strategos and so on, but not in relation to the contemporary democracies right now. That was a reduction of epistemic authorities to the technocracy only, but it seems to me that what is necessary is some sort of the balance between the epistemic authorities and the role of the demos as such. So my question is, could you please elaborate on this? How do you see the role of the epistemic authorities in contemporary democracies, especially after the experiences with pandemics?
Yeah, that is indeed a devilishly difficult question. I'll take a stab at an answer by first of all saying something that may or may not strike people as plausible, but to me at least, it's not so self-evident that our world is vastly more complex than in the past. Of course, there have been changes. Of course, there are different variables. But if you had, I don't know, if you turn to a leading politician in 1973 confronted with stagflation, lots of uncertainties in the Cold War, I'm not sure this person, if they could look at our world today, would say, oh, our world was so much simpler. So, obviously, if you follow certain social theories, certain type of systems theory, yes, you will, in a sense, tell a certain story about complexity. But I worry. I'm not saying you did this, but when I occasionally hear this argument, it strikes me as a sort of strange form of self-pity that, oh, we have it uniquely difficult because our life is now so more complex than previous generations. And I'm not sure we can sort of state that quite in such a blanket fashion. Now, as to basically the role of knowledge in society, clearly there is, in my view, a danger of ending up with technocracy / epistocracy. And as I'm not the first and probably not the last to point out, there's also a particular dynamic in our time where technocracy, epistocracy on the one hand, and so-called populism on the other hand, despite all the obvious differences, in a perverse way, start mirroring each other because they're both forms of anti-pluralism. In one case, one uniquely correct answer, no rational person could disagree. If you disagree, you out yourself, you reveal yourself to be irrational. In the other case, there is a uniquely authentic will of the people. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be, take your pick, traitor to the people, a bad Pole, a bad Hungarian, Poles of the worst sort, whatever it might be. So these both these supposed extremes opposed to each other actually sort of work towards the same thing, which is a certain destruction of pluralism and party politics in particular. And as many of you will know, that argument has now also been laid out in much more detail in many ways in the book about techno-populism by Chris Bickerton and Carlo Invernizzi, who sort of also look at how these two can even merge in some movements and parties. So the upshot of all this is simply to say that yes, there should be certain constraints on our debates in terms of, to put it as crudely as possible, facts. But the idea that we should follow the science is a profoundly undemocratic one. And basically makes us forget that science doesn't actually, tell us one-to-one what to do. What we still have to do ourselves is to make very difficult judgments, including very difficult judgments about which values to prioritize when we deal with certain challenges. And again, forgive me for sort of harping on about this particular point, to be in a position to have these debates in a meaningful and ideally even, at the risk of sounding very cliched, productive way, it just helps to have both political parties and a well-functioning news media environment, which kind of on some level sort of enforces the boundaries of these debates, but at the same time opens up a genuine pluralistic debate around them. So that's something that I think has massively decayed for all kinds of reasons. I don't feel like I need to lecture people in Australia about problems in the media environment, but I think that's sort of what's much more problematic, but in a certain way also where you can do something, as opposed to just lamenting, oh, why don't people listen to experts? Why are they so epistemically closed in certain ways? I mean, situations where this has happened in horrendous ways, with, as we all know, horrendous costs in terms of human suffering and so on. This is not some bottom-up, oh, the people went crazy overnight. This is, in a very real sense, the outcome of actors that precisely belong to this critical infrastructure, political parties and certain, supposedly news media organizations, although with some of them, and I think you know which ones I'm talking about, one uses, the label news with some hesitation. That's not to say that, oh, everybody is totally dominated and manipulated and you can do with people whatever you want. But I think we know enough about the path dependency, about some of what has also happened in the pandemic, especially because we have such a, unfortunately, such a huge array of possible comparison points. And we can see, where basically leaders and basically political parties pushed in one direction and where they didn't. And this was not, I think this does not correlate with, oh, in country X, people are generally more willing to believe in science or not, and so on. It had basically political causes. And to that extent, we might still harbor some hope that there could be a political remedy of some sort or another. Having said that, sorry, I'm about to slip into lecture mode, which is horrible. Just one more thought, and I'm sure somebody will bring this up sooner or later. Of course, the problem with all these sort of remedies, which some of you also have been kind enough to mention, which are in the book, the problem is, of course, it's a little bit the Rousseau problem. In order to actually implement some of these things, you already would have had to have the solution. And you can't think of these things in a sort of vacuum in terms of, oh, right, we could have some, fantastic device for campaign finance, or we could think of ideal media regulations. I mean, these things are not, sort of rocket science in all cases, but how to actually get to a point when your system basically is already so decayed that, the very remedy would have to be there for you to actually make some progress, in which case you wouldn't really need to progress. That, I think, is the really hard one. The only excuse I can muster for not sort of really being able to address that is simply that, again, at the risk of sounding pedantic, different national constellations are really different. And we shouldn't pretend that there is going to be a sort of one size fits all sort of political strategy that could possibly move us forward here.
May I add something to this? I think my question is pandemics, but what you said now, can we also use in relation to lawyers? Because on the one hand, you wrote that, and I agree totally, that democracy needs a structure, institutional structure. And then the danger is juristocracy, right? Potentially. It means epistemic authority of judges, of lawyers as such. So it means how to combine this one element. It means that democracy needs sort of the certainty connected with structure, and then one of in your subtitles you wrote uncertainty. It means equality, liberty, and uncertainty. So how do you combine, put it together, these two elements? But in the center is question of knowledge, right?
So let me say two things, if I may. First of all, maybe to clear up any possible misunderstandings about what uncertainty means here. This is not a foundational political value in the way that liberty and equality are. It was simply a way of gesturing to a well-known insight from our colleague Adam Przeworski, who, as you all know, famously argued that democracy on one level can be understood as institutionalized uncertainty. So in halfway functioning democracies, we simply don't know what the outcomes are going to be, but we can be roughly sure about what the procedures look like, which is not to say the procedures could never change. Of course they can, but we have at least some stability in this regard. And in autocracies, it's going to be more or less the other way around. So we all know what the outcomes are going to be, more or less, in most cases, but the procedures could be changed arbitrarily at any point if the powers that be find it to be necessary. So it was that idea, but beyond that, it was also the notion that actually has come up in conversation briefly of underlining sort of democracy's openness, its potential dynamism and creativity. I don't want to sound too cliched or starry-eyed about this, but I think it was actually and this maybe by now gives a sense that, you know, the book might be pulling in somewhat different directions. So Wojciech was right to say there is a kind of, at least by some people's standards, a sort of conservative element in trying to vindicate institutions, you know, which are pretty well known from the 19th century already, parties and professional news organizations. But at the same time, it was also pushing back against those who tend to assume that certain changes, again, automatically spell danger. And here, sort of, I'm more skeptical about Adam Przeworski's work. For those of you who've read his book about Crisis of Democracy, if you recall, he makes the argument that one sort of real flashing red light is instability in party systems, where he says, you know, for vast stretches of the 20th century, there was a remarkable level of stability, even across, you know, what we would have thought are major ruptures, wars, you know, Fourth Republic, Fifth Republic in France, and so on. And his argument is partly that since the 90s, there's a level of volatility, instability, change, and so on in the system that he finds disconcerting. And I'm more willing to say, no, democracies are meant to be open. It would be strange if there weren't change. It would be strange if forever, for instance, in, let's say, Spain or Greece, we would have been stuck with two more or less, you know, corrupt parties with a highly technocratic sort of approach in their own ways, as opposed to now, you know, having Podemos, Syriza, etc., and so on. So that's part of what this uncertainty point is about, and in that sense, it's also meant to underline that, again, science is not going to give us certainty about political decisions. It's going to give us boundaries of, you know, how we should plausibly discuss certain issues, but it's not going to give us the answers in that sense. It's not going to give us certainty in that realm. Second part, if I may, just very briefly, and this might push in a somewhat different direction, but I'm curious what people think about this if anybody wants to come back to it. So I think today it's proven, unfortunately, to be a very successful political strategy to basically discredit, actually not so much elites in general, but specifically professionals, and that includes lawyers, of course. And by now, you know, many distinguished colleagues like, you know, Daniel Markovits and others have sort of tied the story together with a particular story about the legitimacy, or as the case may be, illegitimacy of meritocracy. What I hint at in the book, and I think that is I think maybe a point worth making here as well, is that, again, this didn't come out of nowhere. There is a kind of complicity between what nowadays is sometimes lamented as, you know, how come that, you know, people are sort of anti-authoritarian in this stupid way, that they don't, you know, trust experts and so on and so forth. There is a prehistory which has something to do with, for lack of a better term, neoliberalism. The kind of impetus from, well, Thatcherites and Thatcher herself to basically say, look, you know, this is sort of, you know, universities, all these people who sit around, probably Trotskyists, drinking tea all day, criticizing me, never producing anything, can't really measure what they do. This kind of push towards the metric, towards this sort of inbuilt suspicion that maybe professionals are a fraud, and that this is, you know, all done on the basis of claims to knowledge and education. But who knows whether this isn't a kind of, you know, self-reproducing elite where people have each other's backs, and, you know, to some degree there isn't something quite right about this. That, I think, is something that has become obviously very, very powerful, and that then can sometimes become very visible. For instance, in the moment when Trump introduced his cabinet, and, you know, the combined worth of these people, if I remember the figure correctly, was something like $4.3 billion. And this was supposed to be, you know, the cabinet for the people. And clearly, on one level, if there's something to the story I was just trying to develop, it does matter that a lot of these people, precisely with the possible exception of Ben Carson, who you may or may not consider to be a professional, weren't professionals, but they were basically people who said, look, I've made a ton of money. And that really is objective. And that's not on the basis of, you know, education and possibly spurious claim to knowing things better. You know, this is the reality. You can all see this. And hence, you know, we're actually also an elite, but a different kind of elite as opposed to professionals. And I think that merits further thought in terms of how one reverses this decision without now sort of defaulting into claims which, again, claims to certainty, or, you know, maligning supposedly irrational people that, you know, are either implausible or deeply, deeply patronizing. So I'm not sure. I feel I still haven't really answered your question, but I hope it was halfway interesting anyway.
Certainly that. We have, I think, time for one more question from our panelists before we open for discussion. And there's a nice segue between what we've just been saying and what Wojciech has been interested in, which is political equality. So let me ask him to move to that issue.
All right. So this is a little bit more in philosophy rather than politics as such. And it is about the first main concept of your triad, that is equality, which I also believe to be absolutely foundational for democracy. But I would like to sort of press you just a little bit about how you understand that political equality in democratic context. Because the usual dilemma is that on the one hand, when we posit equality as a, say, equal impact upon important political decisions of all individuals, it is both unattractive and implausible. It's implausible because it cannot be done. I mean, we cannot have the equal impact as, I don't know, vice president or president of the United States, etc. And it's not attractive because it would require equalization of certain factors which we don't want to be equal. I mean, why people who had invested plenty of knowledge and time and so on in getting aware of intricacy of policies have the same impact as someone who deliberately sort of dismisses importance of these things. So on the other hand, we may have equality in a very thin way, just as a one person, one vote, but obviously it's not ambitious enough. It's not the sort of equality that we want to fight for as at least some sort of impact upon decisions, because we know that the impact of an individual voter is close to zero. So in terms of the difference that she can make. So how do you construe your philosophical concept of political equality? You make some gestures throughout your book to something like equality of political opportunity or of likelihood that you have impact on decisions that serve your interests. So you say that one answer to a question about what political equality means, you say at 78, is this: a roughly equal likelihood of getting the policy that serves one's interest. But I think that you dismiss that as the best answer, and rightly so. It would basically put people in a very passive way. Even the most authoritarian but benevolent ruler may actually try to make sure that everyone's interests are properly taken into account. So, and I haven't found, frankly, throughout the book, an elaborate, nuanced discussion of this issue. So how do you construct that concept?
Yeah, so you're right that in a sense, if we held a standard such as equality of impact or equality of having one's preferences taken into account, it's not just by most people's lights unrealistic, it's also problematic because it would sort of take the freedom to get engaged, to do particular things in politics potentially out of the equation. Hence also, as I was trying to hint earlier, while both principles are foundational, they occasionally also do pull in different directions. The way I construe it is basically in two ways. So as hopefully also becomes clear in the book, I have sympathy with what in recent discussions in political theory has been known particularly as social equality. So more the sense that, people need to be able to look each other in the eye. There has to be some sense that, we don't have quasi-feudal relations where some always have to scrape and bow and so on. I think that's attractive. It only goes so far because, we do live in democratic systems, but in many ways we don't live in truly democratic societies. So it'll be very hard to say that this is an ideal that can truly be fully implemented or be adjudicated necessarily in all kinds of situations. But it matters not least because that kind of social inequality can translate into a distinct form of political inequality and even become a sort of vicious circle. And that's something which goes back to a previous discussion about, let's say, for shorthand, authoritarian right-wing populism in particular, where, you know, I know that some of you might not find this the most plausible rendering, but at least for me, the strategy is precisely to constantly tell people that some of our fellow citizens either don't belong at all or are at best second rate. So an outright denial or insinuation of a very, very basic sense of equality. And since this is a real world challenge and is out there, I think it's important to reaffirm this sort of package of social equality and the political equality, which necessarily is tied to it. Because once you kind of insinuate that some people don't really belong or are at best second rate, you're well on the way of also actually concretely finding, and this goes back to the discussion about fake democracy, of concretely finding ways of disempowering them politically completely. So that's one part of the construction. The other part of the construction is basically the demand that, you know, given the inequalities we already have in our societies, the political system should not work in such a way that they are compounded further. This is the point about campaign finance. We know that we're not going to get to anything, and this is, you know, a well-known set of arguments in the campaign finance literature that, you know, if you really wanted to be serious about a certain kind of equality, you really would have to tell people, no, you're not allowed to found a think tank. No, you're not allowed to write a book, because then you're going to have more impact with your book where you spread your crazy libertarian ideas than somebody else, and so on. So we know that's off the table. But still, it's another thing to say that our sort of institutional infrastructure is in such a horrendous state that in many countries, alas, it actually allows people to translate inequalities in other parts of society directly into politics and even compound them in certain ways. So one example in the book that you may remember that sort of just illustrates this point is the French system, where basically, since you can deduct political expenses, donations from your taxes, it's another way of saying that basically the poor end up subsidizing the political preferences of the rich. And that's something that seems to be an obvious violation of this basic underlying idea that the political system shouldn't sort of actively work to actually increase inequalities in a certain way. One other thing, maybe also in response to something that Adam said earlier. So yes, there's, you know, they're all good. I mean, they're all good, all kinds of good reasons to say, look, you know, any discussion about Athenian democracy can only help us so much. It's true, of course. At the same time, I think this remains an incredibly important stimulus for us to kind of really sort of re-examine so much of what we take for granted. And, you know, everybody here will know the famous arguments by Bernard Manin about, okay, let's really think about lotocracy, or, you know, selection by lot in relation to elections and representation. And let's, you know, truly examine ourselves, how ready we truly are to, for instance, take political equality seriously in the sense of an expectation that, yeah, we should all be competent enough, trust each other enough, and so on, that all of us could potentially fill offices. And, you know, I think most of us would end up rejecting that idea for various reasons, but it remains very important to go through the steps as to why exactly, and how we sort of then have certain trade-offs with other principles, as opposed to kind of complacently thinking that, well, you know, of course we're sort of living up to a certain idea of equality.
Thank you. It's now, I think, right time to move to Q&A from the audience, which is a source of pleasure, but also distress for me, because I was dying to ask a question. And I thought of a way of making these two desires complementary by introducing a question which is inspired by John Keane, who is in our audience and has some questions there. And I'll just introduce my part and ask if John would like to take it on as well as add his own. And it's briefly this. Jan, your book is primarily about how to get citizens re-engaged in the sense of able to be both better informed and better able to influence the exercise of power in a democracy. And the sort of democracy you're talking about is representative democracy. John, in many of his books, and most recently in his latest book, The Shortest History of Democracy, discusses what he takes to be a new and important development, which he called monitory democracy, democracy that monitors the exercise of power. And that relates, of course, to many legal issues. How do you keep the bastards honest? How can you tame, temper, constrain arbitrary power, not in the extreme circumstances only that you deal with in the last chapter, militant democracy, disobedience, but in the everyday workings of power. And there's a rich range of things to which he points, new, not legal necessarily, social ways of monitoring which are springing up. And since I know that John is very interested in that, I'm hoping that he will take that question further and also ask the questions that he has put in the chat. I hope he hasn't disappeared. Carolyn, can we?
I'm just waiting. I've promoted John to a panelist and I'm just waiting for him to pop up, and there we go.
I hope you're not offended that I've outed
No,
you.
I've been promoted. Thank you very much, Jan, and good morning. I think Martin has said very well things about the infrastructural geography, so to say, of contemporary democracies, which I think you agree are structured by much more than periodic free and fair elections, but also by this constant public monitoring of power. Courts do this, anti-corruption commissions do this, truth and reconciliation forums do this, and so on. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about those mechanisms. I tabled two questions, and perhaps you might, I'm not sure if they're preserved, Carolyn, but you might want to take them away with you. And just very briefly, one question has to do, it's a descriptive question about what you are calling autocracies in this book and in this morning's conversation. It does seem to me that the distinction between fake and real is less plausible than this rather more complicated category of phantom democracies. You know, Russia and China not only practice, they are more than regimes that rule through law, that autocratic legalism that you spoke about. They are regimes that practice periodic elections. They build in consultative mechanisms, you know, public opinion polling, public forums. They camouflage violence, they massage public opinion, and as I say in my remark, you know, encourage the middle classes to go shopping and so on. Democracy feels real and not real, and that's what's really worrying about them. This distinction, I think, between fake and real is, for me, too dualistic. It's too stark. The other comment, which please ignore both of these because I want to hear what others have to say. The other comment has to do with what I would say in your great book is a bit of excessive dependence on Adam Jaworski. I know that that's an heretical thing to say amidst a Polish steering committee, but it is
John. It is John, and you are going to be censored immediately.
So
I agree with Wojciech, yeah.
Yeah, my encouragement, Jan, is that you think again and twice about that dependence on Adam Jaworski's great insight, because it's not only elections that generate uncertainties, and it's not only that institutions of a well-functioning democracy do have mechanisms of overcoming uncertainties that are poisonous or pathological, but democracies which are media saturated today, you know, generate uncertainties about what's true and false. I mean, that's so to say a cultural dynamic that needs to be taken into account. But in your defense, and going well beyond Jaworski, one last remark: it does seem to me that well-functioning monitory democracies contain mechanisms that prevent certainties with an uppercase C among those who wield power. You know, and it's that blindness and arrogance, the hubris, the dangers of arbitrary power that is drunk on what Daniel Kahneman calls illusions of certainty. I mean, democracies prevent those certainties when they work well. They induce, you know, public uncertainties about the cocksuredness of those who govern. Well, it's a remark designed to perhaps intended to ask you to say more about this uncertainty principle and democracy. But thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to unmute. I'll mute myself now.
Yes, thank you very much, John. There's a lot there. I'll try my best to respond to all 3 points in a halfway plausible fashion. So on the sort of dualistic fake and real, of course, it's far too simplistic, as if we could simply easily slot, you know, everything into one or the other. But that's partly why I was sort of invoking the image of a sort of gray area, and that's basically what so many of our colleagues have been struggling with. And yet it's not implausible to say that, okay, there does come a certain point where it's just incredibly difficult to see how you could have a genuine turnover of power. So in that sense, I would stick with, just to make our steering committee also feel better again, I would stick with the Przeworski line on that one. And less obviously, yes, you can have all kinds of things in place that feel like democracy. Yes, of course, Putin wanted to, you know, have civil society representatives. Again, it goes back to this point that you know, some of these figures have really tried very, very hard to learn from history. It's not a secret that the leaders in Beijing are absolutely obsessed with the end of the Soviet Union. What exactly went wrong? What could you have done differently, and so on? So yes, of course, you don't want to, in a sense, put yourself at a terrible epistemic disadvantage by cutting yourself off completely from information from society. You do want to have some meaningful input. You know, you do want to sort of make things happen that sort of, you know, do some of the theater of democracy, but then also to some degree bring in the genuine advantages. But again, going back to point that also came up earlier, the genuine use of basic political rights, and in particular communicative freedoms, the very thing that, in my view, this institutional critical infrastructure is so important for, reaching others, being reached by them. That is basically what's missing, or what only really appears in what I would call a very, very sort of fake kind of form. And that basically is another way of saying, ultimately, people are going to be disempowered. That leads me to the second point. So I'm fully on board, and it is important to recognize the structural changes that you've pointed to, that, you know, Pierre-Rosan Vallon has pointed to, when, you know, there has been important theorizing about a different relationship between, let's say, a sort of 19th century model of parliamentarism and representative democracy, with new institutions in play that uphold certain standards of transparency, accountability, and so on. Where I sort of leave the train, if that's the right metaphor, is when there's a suggestion that one could possibly replace the other. And I don't see you saying that necessarily, but with some of Pierre's work, I think it gets close to saying that, oh, the old model, that was very 20th century, and now it really is something else, especially in the book about good government. That I don't see. And again, on a maybe less obvious note, and by now you know what I'm about to say, the critical infrastructure of democracy precisely also involves institutions like political parties and professional news organizations that always already had a monetary function. I mean, a real opposition in the parliament has the job of monitoring, obviously, and in a well-functioning democracy is going to have the resources of making that happen. And the same is true of a well-functioning press not just in printed, but in the wider sense. And so what I would get more worried about is also in this regard, is some of the internal institutional changes that might push more in the direction of genuine monitoring, and other changes that push more in the direction of amplifying certain pathologies. And one of the things, maybe just as a suggestion for people to think about further, if they like, that I'm still struggling with is the basic question: how platforms in particular fit into this institutional into this institutional story. So to put it very crudely, clearly platforms are not about owning the means of production. They're about owning the means of connections. They're really not fundamentally about rights. They're much more plausibly a matter of access. And yes, we do know that they massively fall short in terms of transparency. So, as for instance, just as our colleague Ned Persley, for instance, has put it recently, we don't even know what we don't know, because these are such black boxes in terms of algorithms and so on. And the worry I have is that we have a tendency to basically think of strategies which on the facially are very plausible. Break up Facebook, more rights for users, more transparency, and so on. I mean, nobody, I think, in their right mind could sort of, totally be against that. At the same time, it's exactly the kind of thing that any good old 19th century liberal would have said already. They would have said more competition, no monopoly, more rights for individuals, more transparency, and so on. And I think one of the really challenging questions for us is whether that sort of repertoire of answers is really enough, and whether, in a sense, this sort of internal structural change, again, in the overall institutional infrastructure of democracy, does not pose challenges that our existing repertoire, including our legal repertoire, is perhaps somewhat insufficient for in certain ways. Last point about uncertainty and being too reliant on Przeworski's work. So as I was hopefully trying to make plausible in some of the previous remarks, the uncertainty is not just about his sort of hardcore definition. I think that does matter, but that doesn't exhaust the importance of a certain type of uncertainty. Again, uncertainty is what our colleague Rainer Forst, I think, would call a normatively dependent concept. It's not in and of itself good. It's not in and of itself bad. You have to tell a larger story around it. It can have that positive effect on democracy, but it can also obviously be experienced as a burden, as, for instance, Sophia Nestrom has recently argued in her book about Spirit of Democracy, or it can indeed amplify certain pathologies to do with the issues that Adam put on the agenda earlier on.
Thank you very much. We have 3 more questions. I just intervene for a second to say one of the things I realized in your last comments is that I didn't ask you to say anything about what I found of an intriguing and resonant discussion of loyal opposition. I never knew that term was introduced in the 19th century as a joke, because it became such an important thing. And I'll defer to my real Poles if I'm wrong here, but it always seemed to me that in Polish, that phrase must sound like a contradiction in terms, at least now. A loyal opposition is not something that anybody in power in Poland could comprehend. And it's a remarkable cultural achievement. But let us move to the questions. I think Michał Stambulski is the first off the rank, and we have 2 more. Michał is from University of Wrocław and the University, I think, of Rotterdam at the moment.
Yes, good evening. I'm very happy to be able to ask the question. It was a very interesting talk and discussion. I must say that I'm a reader of Jan books, but I haven't read this one, so I'm sorry if I will be very ignorant about this. But it seems to me that your previous books, and this is also a question, general comment and the question to all of the commentators. I think the previous book, the Contesting Democracy, was about the past. Then we had the book, What is Populism? It was about the present. And this book seems to me, it's more about the future. And during this talk, we heard a lot about this. We have to do something. We have to change this epistemic relation with populism, with democracy, and so on. So I'm wondering, what is the subject of this needed of change? What is this we? Because it seems to me that we have a problem here when we think about democracy, that it's not so obvious. If we think about this populism challenge towards democracy, so at the same time, we have in the practice of such populist regimes like in Poland, Hungary, maybe also Donald Trump environment, we have at the same time this kind of rhetoric of some kind of essentialism, philosophically speaking, and the political practice of very constructivism that you can shape and somehow using the media and some kind of other resources to shape the consciousness of the people. So I'm wondering, so what would be this kind of subject nowadays that needed to change of democracy? Aren't we this kind of revenge of postmodernist situation that we are in this kind of constructivist situation that there is no this kind of subject, that whenever we try to find it, we cannot really pick up some kind of social groups that would be this kind of backbone of today's democracy. And that gets me back to the question, so how would you look at the notion of citizenship today, which was always some kind of this kind of Archimedesian point of establishing democracy. Democracy, going back to the ancient Athens, were those of the citizens, those who had some kind of real connection regarding living in the same place, living in the same community, and later maybe having the property in those communities. So how would the citizenship would be in this kind of more essentialism connection, besides having only this kind of formal relation, having the passport of some kind of country? And what would we need to think about some kind of global citizenship and global possibilities? So what would that be now? Or so again, what is the subject of democracy today and how it connects, or whether it connects with the notion of citizenships? Thank you very much. And this is a question to all of the commentators.
Only Jan will have time to respond, I think.
Thank you.
So thank you. Let me try to say three things, and forgive me if I'm missing the real thrust of your remarks. So, if essentialism means any sort of sense that, oh well, certain groups are bound to act in certain ways, like we used to say in the good old days, only the working class is the revolutionary subject, and so on. No, of course not that kind of essentialism. In a strange way, I think there's a sort of bit of indulgence of that today when you have these very sort of facile generalizations about, social democrats have lost all their voters to the far right. Empirically, that's often actually a completely false statement, as some of our colleagues in comparative politics by now have figured out. So the we is a construction, and is still, if you want to bring in that kind of terminology, is a matter of cultural hegemony construction in terms of what you actually mobilize as effective collective actors. Now, more concretely, now that we've had at least a decade, if not more, of basically building up a unfortunately ever longer catalog of what kind of mistakes opposition parties in more or less populist regimes can make in terms of failing to actually build certain coalitions, generating a certain sense of we, in response to, a kind of top-down identity politics from certain actors. I think we can say certain much more concrete things about what you should do, what you shouldn't do. The book sort of tries to go a little bit in the direction of what can be done in this respect. And for the umpteenth time, I know by now it sounds like a broken record, while we cannot sort of magically fix our critical infrastructure of democracy, at least a very important first step is to have criteria at hand how to judge their state, or if that's not an inappropriate medical metaphor, their sort of health. And again, the book tries to sort of tell a story about the duty and capacity of such institutions to basically stage political conflict in a way that is productive and not destructive for democracy, says something about the importance of pluralism outside and inside these institutions, says something about the way they structure political time. That's, I think, where, at least for me, the important discussion is also located. And therefore, last thing, just as an illustration of this otherwise perhaps overly abstract point, think about all these also sometimes very general discussions where people say, oh, the problem is, attacks on the media. The media is enemies of the people. We all know the strategy by now has worked, unfortunately, very well in many countries. But to start a generalization about the media, I think is already to go down the wrong path. We have to be much more careful in terms of basically disaggregating what we're actually talking about, and then also what, in a sense, we're looking to fix or to change in certain ways. So just very briefly, if I may, there's a distinct problem with sort of journalists as individual actors with a particular kind of ethos and how they think about politics. If you think about the country I'm in right now, people are slowly waking up to the fact that a traditional ethos of reporting in a functioning two-party system, this side says this and that side says that, is no longer appropriate in a situation of profound asymmetrical polarization, where if you present it as symmetrical, you actually, as many people by now have pointed out, are actually distorting things in a certain way. So it's a distinct challenge for a journalistic ethos. Then there's a distinct challenge at the level of the press as a collective actor, not just printed publications, but basically something like the press corps that occasionally still shows up at official press conferences in countries. There, the distinct challenge would be to basically destroy the collective solidarity of that collective agent. Just think back to Trump, having these press conferences where he would pick on individual journalists, and then other journalists would fail to basically live up to this expectation of collective solidarity. And then at the deepest level, well-known phenomenon, of course, to many people in this conversation, the systematic destruction of pluralism of independent professional news organizations. So the well-known strategy that you get your, oligarchs who are allied with you to buy newspapers, buy TV channels, and so on. So that doesn't get us necessarily all that much closer to immediate solutions, but at least it allows us to see different problems at different levels, as opposed to, oh, let's generalize about the media, and then let's think about what different approaches might be appropriate at different levels, be it regulation, be it a rethinking of an individual ethos, be it a sort of shoring up and rewarding of a certain kind of solidarity, and so on and so forth. So again, I feel I've not actually answered your question at all, but again, I hope it was halfway interesting in certain ways.
Thank you. We have two more questions, and I wonder if we can, Carolyn, ask them both and then ask Jan to reply to them together. One is from Jerzy Przyban from University of Cardiff and Charles University Prague, and the other from Jose Banes, who I believe is in Cambridge at the moment. Jerzy. And if I could ask, just because we are under some time constraints, if the questions could be concised.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. It was absolutely great to listen to you. I also had some reservations about this distinction between fake and a real democracy, because I worry that we are analytically backsliding when we talk about the populists and autocrats as ruling by cheating, indicating almost as they are fake, we are true. Yeah, we are almost like backsliding to the jargon of authenticity, to use good old Adorno here. But you described it very beautifully, and that the current crisis is a crisis also of the social contract. So my question is, isn't the real problem with democracy, it's not rules, but it's disappearing as the form of life? Because you have a collapse of civil society, which sounds so 19th century now. Political parties which were able to mobilize large parts of population don't have this force anymore. And you just mentioned the media, that we now talk very openly that the press has to be ethically committed, something which almost already invites taking sides, being partisan, rather than creating the final expression public sphere. do we still have the public sphere, and what can constitute a public sphere in the age of digital media, social platforms, non-platforming policies, and very limited powers, mobilization powers of traditional political parties. Thank you.
Jose? I'm not sure. Have we got Jose online?
From Jose, we have a question in the context of Chile rewriting its constitution, where he gives some context, but then asks the question, in the need of a majority building language that speaks to the future, could a communitarian liberal Anthropocene be crafted as counteroffer? A counteroffer that is inclusive, as admitting Philip Selznick's ideas and part of, say, Scott's anarchism. I'll leave that with you.
Yeah.
In 1 minute, if I see it correctly, yeah?
You can have one.
No problem.
You can have one.
No problem. I think I'll need to ponder the last question more. Please forgive me for the cop out. About the well, two things, and maybe also to, especially if you invite people from the US, I think there's a kind of ethical obligation to say something uplifting at the very end. So I'm not sure, but if you look at democracy as a form of life, and if you focus on questions of social equality, it seems to me it's not so easy to argue that we're on a kind of downhill trajectory. I mean, if you think about just as the most obvious aspect, yes, it's true. There is still no country in the world that has true gender equality. Even Sweden falls egregiously short. But if that is one criterion for talking about genuine social equality and democracy as a way of life, it seems to me very hard to argue that it would have somehow been better in whatever the 50s or even the 60s or anything of that sort. So I think they also have counted that there are different and contradictory developments that we're witnessing, and it's at least not implausible to argue, as many people indeed have done, that some of the sort of worst forms of politics we see today are actually not really an indication that the future as a whole will be like that, but actually that it's sort of a last-ditch attempt to defend what is in many cases simply indefensible. In terms of the media being ethically committed, at the risk of saying something horribly shocking, I don't, also from the point of view of the framework developed in the book, I don't have any problem with ethically committed media organizations. Even partisan media organizations are completely okay. Up until the 70s, if I remember the number correctly, more than 90% of newspapers in Scandinavian countries were connected to political parties. But nobody said, oh, this is the end of the world, and this is, all fake news and relativism, and nobody knows what the truth is anymore. As long as, to pick up an important term from Honora O'Neill, as long as these things are accessible, and as long as these institutions basically stick within certain hard borders of facts and basically not denying the equal standing of all citizens, you can have openly avowed positions. You can say to your readers, look, we explain the world to you from a distinct working class perspective. There's absolutely nothing wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that sort of thing. So in that sense, I don't think that I mean, in certain ways, yes, there has been a problem with the public sphere. Again, the decay of the critical infrastructure. In certain ways, but it is important to get these criteria right for assessing them, and that does not mean, I hasten to add, that we should default into checklist approaches, as you all know, very effectively critiqued by our colleague Kim Shepley. That's not the point. It's not like, oh, let's check for these 5 things and then everything is well, but having some sense of what can go wrong, and not worrying about the wrong thing. I'm not worried about an openly avowed partisan perspective, as long as that sticks to the facts, as long as it's clear where somebody is coming from, as long as there's a clear sense that you have what I think another observer at one point simply called transparent partiality. That's fine. And it was, especially in the US, of course, not so unusual that both political parties and newspapers had this kind of transparent partiality. So in that sense, as usual, there were no golden ages. There's no past that we can idealize. The past will not hold the answers to our problems. We have to do it ourselves. But let's make sure that we are sort of looking for the right thing, and hence also don't. I'm trying finally to get to the uplifting part, and hence also not despair entirely about some of these developments. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And this was an extraordinarily rich discussion.
And Martin, if I may, I will pass to Jan and the panelists the other questions that were raised in the text box,
Sure.
and including Jose's question and the remarks from John Cain, for example, but all of the materials from the text box will be shared to the panelists.
Good. Well, one of the things I was going to say now is to thank Carolyn, who is the organizational genius of this outfit. There's not much other genius of that sort in this outfit, so thank heaven that she is here to offer that. And there are other thanks. Of course, we thank the Australian Research Council. Most of all, we thank Jan for giving us his time. At least he didn't have to miss breakfast, but other than that, it was such a rich response. And also, not only is uncertainty a theme about democracy, but a kind of wrestling with, rather than tamping down, intellectual uncertainty to allow for complexity, but not by just saying, well, it all depends, or it's all very complex, but filling it up, but not tying it down. I found that exhilarating. And thanks to our panelists, the usual duo, and thanks to the audience. And we will reassemble at the end of April, either the 26th or the 27th of April, to discuss the book by Andras Sajor of the Central European University in Budapest and former judge of the European Court of Human Rights. His recent book, which was mentioned, not with complete approbation, I thought, by Yige, ruling by cheating. Until then, and again, thanks to everybody, good morning and good night.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
sorry,
you very
could I
much.
just
Thank
one other thing. One question we didn't raise, which I won't ask you to answer, but I think we should really think about. It's Adam's question, partly geographically stimulated. What is the role of external factors in sustaining and wrecking democracy? Appropriately asked from Białystok, and something for us to keep in mind in future days and weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated. Thank you.